So thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to see everybody here, and so many people I've known for so long, and new friends as well. People I've worked with in this field with Meth for nearly 15 years, and others I've just gotten to know. So I'm really thrilled that you're here to help me celebrate the birth of this book. Tonight I want to do just a little reading. I want to do a little talking, and hopefully a little conversation with people out there to talk about. But first I want to just say why I wrote this book. Probably 15 years ago, as a therapist, I started seeing gay men coming into my office dealing with sexual issues. And at first, the drug didn't come up. They were coming in for erectile dysfunction and all kinds of intimacy issues. And if we dug a little bit deeper, what it turned out was that they were really struggling with this, at that time, new wave of a drug called methamphetamine that was hitting the streets big time back in 2001, 2002. And we didn't know what to do. And a number of us in this room got together and we were talking about how to deal with it and what to do with this new problem we're seeing and how to address it. And it was a problem being really addressed over the course of the country as well. And we came together and we did a lot of public teaching and a lot of research about how we could try to do this. But at that time there wasn't really any resources, and that was the beginning of this book. So I really wanted to not only share what I learned and learned from other people, but also to give the message that there is recovery from methamphetamine. I think a lot of us in the gay community have grown up with this belief that meth is sort of, you're lost if you get involved with meth. And it's a very difficult drug. People struggle a lot. But there is now, 10 years later, 15 years later, we know there are people around with 8 years, 10 years. There are models to look at for people to recover. So that's a really critical piece in this book as well, is to really provide some hope and provide some examples of people that are doing it. So let me just start by reading just a passage from the book, and just kind of sets the stage for what follows. Brian lay on the floor of his condominium, naked and unable to force his body to move. He became acutely aware of the air conditioning vents while staring at the ceiling. He could hear a strange whistling coming through them, while his rational mind told him it was simply the flow of air. He was certain he also heard strains of voices and music woven into the stream of sound. He was convinced that there was a camera placed just behind the vent, silently observing everything he did. Everything, including the hours of pornography that played silently on his laptop on the carpet next to him, his endless masturbation, even the nameless tricks that had been there using his meth. Brian wasn't sure who the men were, or if they were gone, or what they might have stolen. As he lay on the floor, Brian's brain seemed to be thinking faster than his body could move. He was aware of a slight tremor in his hands over which he had no control. He was aware that his nose was impossibly dry and that his side above his kidneys ached. His penis was raw from hours of masturbation. He couldn't remember the last time he'd drunk any water and knew that he hadn't eaten for days. His brain seemed supercharged and hyper-alert to everything in the room. It overwhelmed his capacity to process the mass of information his senses were collecting. Brian was convinced that the silent camera and yet-to-be-discovered microphones were conveying his every movement to the police, and he was certain they would burst through the door at any moment. He recalled another time he'd been convinced the police were just outside the door. On that occasion, he vacated his apartment and moved to the bathhouse for several days. Even there, he knew he had been followed and stayed in his cubicle the entire time. Now, as he lay on the floor, he tried to remember when that was, but time had become a blur. And those of you, I think, that have worked with meth or experienced meth can probably identify with a lot of aspects of that paragraph. It's really a combination of a lot of people, indeed. My journey from when that client first came in, many clients like Brian, I didn't understand what was going on. So I went back and got a doctorate in sex therapy, sexology. And so the perspective of this book is to really bring together those issues of addiction and mental health and sex therapy into one. And the book is really geared toward both people, gay men living with meth and trying to get past meth, and professionals. I try to walk that fine line. If you've read the book, you know that it's divided into 3 parts. The first is what I call the perfect storm. And I think meth has come in an era when we have HIV still persistent in terms of rates. We have chronic addiction, and we have gay men who are using it as a sexual drug. And that's a really bad combination for HIV risk. The second part is exploring the sexual universe. As a sex therapist, I think people don't understand the whole nature of sexual templates and how sexual patterns work, and the fact that methamphetamine particularly can really hijack those sexual templates and change people's sexual functioning in a really profound way. And that was the problem I was seeing initially when clients were coming in complaining of sexual problems. It's because they'd given up crystal meth, and along with crystal went their sex lives. And they didn't kind of know how to reintegrate both sexual functioning and intimacy in a healthy way into their lives. And the final piece of this is what I call restoring your life, and it integrates a lot of my own journey in the last 10 years in terms of not just traditional therapy healing, but other kinds of healing, hypnotherapy and breath work and other kinds of more, I think, significant kinds of therapies that can move beyond. So how does meth work? For those of you that don't know what's going on with meth, it works on a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and it's in the limbic system of the brain. The limbic system is the part of our brain that handles all desire. So it's desire of food, it gives us reward. So if we have a nice plate of meatballs and maybe pasta and chewy bread, we get a little burst of dopamine. If we have sex, we have a burst of dopamine. If we have a nicotine, which actually releases more dopamine than sex, a cigarette, it's a burst. The same thing goes with cocaine. Of course, many people, cocaine is another stimulant, another amphetamine like meth. Cocaine releases a certain amount of dopamine. Methamphetamine releases 4 times the amount of dopamine that cocaine does. And that's the difference. A lot of people wonder, what's the difference between cocaine and meth? It's 4 times the amount. It's highly, highly addictive. And so what happens with methamphetamine, it quickly becomes, the brain just latches onto that. And I think most guys that I have talked to that are dealing with meth are trying to recapture that first experience the rest of their career with methamphetamine, because it's so amazing in terms of the sex. I've had clients compare sex on meth to like a black and white TV suddenly becoming a color TV. You know, it's very profound. And I think that's really, really dangerous because people are constantly trying to reinvent that experience. And even in recovery, people try to kind of reinvent meth sex without the meth. And I think that can be a problem. What's happened over the last 10 years is that we had this wave of methamphetamine in 2004, 2005, and the federal government caught on, and at that time most meth was made by what we call mom and pop labs. The people would gather a lot of Sudafed and mix it together with all kinds of things from Home Depot, sometimes blowing up their barn or their outhouse or wherever they were making this batch of stuff, and that was how it was made. In 2006 or 7, they started to limit how much Sudafed people could purchase. So if you tried to buy Sudafed, you know you have to go to the pharmacy counter and show your driver's license, and you're limited in how much you can make. And what that did was knock out the mom and pop business. They lost their business, but in stepped the Mexican drug cartels. And so now we have a rise in methamphetamine again that is much higher purity, much cheaper, and much more devastating. We're seeing people getting addicted faster, sooner. Back originally 10 years ago, slamming or injection drug use was kind of the end stage of use, if you will. I'm seeing young guys now starting with slamming, right away, which to me is a very frightening idea. So what does meth do? It gives people confidence, it gives them energy, it gives them sexual stamina, this whole sense of connection, and I think that's the core of what I want to talk about tonight, is this idea that as gay men, I think we are looking for connection and intimacy and belonging somehow. And I think methamphetamine is like the perfect drug to simulate that, but it's such a trap. And that's the experience, I think, of so many gay men. What it does to sexual desire is just stoke it to impossibly high sections. And there's a couple of populations that I see are particularly at risk. I see a lot of clients who are in their 40s, 50s, even 60s. I had a 70-year-old meth client this year. And they are, I think, because of what I mentioned about people lacking energy and not feeling so good about themselves, meth is a perfect kind of antidote for that. And I just want to read one quote from a client. At 50, I don't exist so socially in the gay community anymore. Having a connection is very cool, albeit temporarily, but it's better than being invisible when I want to get laid. I think that's a common experience with older guys being drawn into methamphetamine. The reverse of that are a lot of younger guys who think, I've discovered a new drug. And we know that meth has been around in the gay community since the 70s and probably even before. So that it comes in waves. But the issue now is that it's so much higher potency and more addictive. So what does meth do in terms of sexual behavior? It leads to a lot of high-risk sexual behavior. It leads to unprotected receptive anal intercourse, which is the most dangerous kind of intercourse for getting HIV or Hep C or whatever. And interesting footnote, a lot of guys think that's just gay men behaving badly, if you will. There's been studies on heterosexuals using meth. They do the same thing. They have an increase in anal intercourse as well, which is kind of, I think it has something to do with the methamphetamine itself, in addition to the gay cultural part of that. There's multiple partners. Other needs are set aside. In the example of Brian, we talked about not drinking for days. People don't eat for days. People don't take care of themselves. They neglect. I had clients miss family events, weddings. Everybody just couldn't get together to get out of the house. A lot of problem. And when it hits its peak, and relatively soon, there's a lot of psychosis as well. So this name Brian that I gave to that client was experiencing all kinds of paranoia and psychosis, and that does happen quite frequently. So people get really kind of out of their mind in a way. That often goes away with methamphetamine, but if people have pre-existing conditions, sometimes that it doesn't always get back to the baseline level. So it's kind of tinkering with some very tricky business. Another aspect of meth is that it decreases empathy. It does this in the brain. It decreases the ability of people to connect with each other, and that's the irony of it, because a lot of guys take it because they do feel that kind of intense, artificial connection. I call it artificial connection. But there's been some fascinating studies in the last year or so of how methamphetamine users, when shown different pictures of faces, and there'll be facial expressions of happiness, sadness, anger, sorrow, all these different faces. People on methamphetamine can't distinguish the facial expressions. They're impaired in their ability to differentiate. And it comes down to one kind of expression. Does anybody have a guess what somebody often on meth will interpret the sentiment being conveyed to them as? Hostility. So people will read in hostility even if it's not necessarily hostile. There's a misinterpretation of a lot of the empathy. The other thing is that with any dopamine-related, and meth and porn go hand in hand, so we see a lot of sex addiction and with meth use as well. But they say that dopamine has a short shelf life. And what that means is that dopamine, what's exciting today, will be kind of boring tomorrow. And so people have to up the ante. And so people get into riskier sexual behaviors, darker sexual behaviors, rougher sexual behaviors, and kind of in an effort to kind of constantly get that level of stimulation that they're chasing all the time. The same thing happens with pornography. There's an epidemic right now in this country of erectile dysfunction based on people looking at so much porn they can't get aroused by their partner or by human beings anymore. That's the same phenomenon going on there. There's a lot of laughter in the room. I think that's one thing that we don't have the data on, but I would love to see is the number of erectile dysfunction problems among young men who shouldn't have any physiological problems but have a porn problem. So,
reference on that.
sorry?
Yeah, a little reference on that. This is very striking.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of research on that yet. It's just observing. So there's this need for increased stimulation, increased excitement, increased risk, and a lot of it, of course, leads to a problem. But the biggest single, I think, problem with methamphetamine is this, what's called diffusion of meth and sex. Anything with dopamine just starts to combine. The brain will fuse those together. And so if gay men are using meth and other drugs, they use it often with G and other kinds of drugs as well. But meth is the big culprit in this scenario. It'll fuse with sex. As I mentioned, when people get clean, oftentimes they have a terrible time having any sexual arousal at all because their sexual life has gone with the meth. And that's really the whole half of the second half of this book is dealing with that problem, which has been a huge problem for a lot of men. So that fusion has been quite dramatic. So I'm going to read a little passage about that from the book as well. Among the most devastating of the losses created by meth is the feeling that one's sexuality has somehow been permanently damaged. Men continue to describe themselves as sexual cripples during abstinence. Many are unable to function sexually without the drug. They find that nothing fires sexual desire, and many believe that nothing ever will bring it truly alive again. Even voluntary recovery, the ability to experience pleasure, is at times elusive for those without support. This fusion of meth and sex becomes particularly obvious when someone in recovery attempts to extricate crystal meth from their life. Sexual thoughts, sexual feelings, and seemingly casual events such as smells, sounds, and visual cues become a minefield that require careful and conscious maneuvering. Sex, therefore, becomes threatening and dangerous because it sets off drug cues. An attractive man walking in the street, notification of an instant message, the sensation of walking to a bar, even getting blood drawn at the doctor's office, can set off drug cravings that lead directly to sexual desires and fantasies. Many newly clean meth users even describe strong triggers evoked by walking into a crystal meth anonymous meeting, where one might see former tricks, or simply be exposed to a sexually charged room full of gay men. This is disquieting for many in early recovery because they feel they must totally suppress sexual thoughts in order to avoid a relapse. And that's a fairly common experience for people. One of the things that happens with this tolerance is that, it was what's described to me, the brain, when it becomes accustomed to so much stimulation coming at it that meth causes, it basically compensates. So it kind of turns down the volume. And it's to shed dopamine receptors. Meth works by blocking the dopamine receptors, so there's a lot of meth flooding the synapse. It makes you feel great. Cocaine does the same thing, but cocaine is a natural molecule that washes away in 15 minutes. Cocaine sits there for 8 or 9 or 10 hours. So it just kind of burns up that synapse. And by the way, it's neurotoxic, and this is one of the other big problems with methamphetamine, is that methamphetamine sits on that dopamine receptor and will eventually destroy it. It eats through it. And so eventually people are losing the dopamine receptors in their brain, which means their ability to experience pleasure or any of the good feelings that normal dopamine levels should cause is really impaired. And it's impaired for a long time. There's been, and I should have a pointer in my PowerPoint, but there's beautiful color slides that show fMRI studies of someone with 1 month clean of meth, and their brain looks exactly like it did on the day they first got it clean. Guess what? It looks almost the same way 12 months later. It takes 18 months, up to 18 months for the brain to restore, because the brain literally has to rewire all those neural pathways. And so put yourself in the position of somebody struggling with a very difficult drug, full of triggers, who want to get clean, and they're clawing their way through each day of abstinence, right? And 1 day, a week, a month, and not feeling any better. And along with this lack of dopamine goes a sense of hopelessness, depression, and just a general inability to kind of feel excited. And I think that is a huge struggle for people trying to maintain their sobriety because they're not feeling any better for a long, long time. So that's kind of setting the stage. I did want to focus tonight on the recovery piece. And I'll read just another quote from the client to lead into that. Being sober is tremendously satisfying, but my deeper recovery has been overcoming depression and working through lifelong personal issues. I think that's the key to really getting into solid recovery, is that meth, and any drug, any addiction, but I think methamphetamine particularly, is like the world's greatest antidepressant. It really, really is effective at numbing emotions and feelings and just putting them aside. I had a client say, it's like, he said, I don't give a fuck in a drug form, but that's basically just, it's a way of disconnecting from all the concerns that people have. And so if I as a therapist start working with someone and getting abstinent, what's going to happen as soon as I take away those drugs that have been keeping all that stuff numb, they're going to start feeling feelings, right? All the feelings, all the issues, including many that were in existence before meth. And meth creates a lot of chaos, and meth just messes up people's lives big time. They lose partners, houses, cars, jobs. All that aside, all these pre-existing issues really need to be addressed. And that's critically important for people in the recovery community and for therapists to be aware of as well. Now, it's not an easy road, but it is possible, and that's the point I really want to talk about tonight as well. This recovery trajectory, if you will, it's a long road, as I mentioned. It takes about 18 months to those neural pathways to reconnect, but there's several distinct phases. Methamphetamine, for those of you in healthcare know that amphetamines are not criteria for inpatient treatment. So if somebody's struggling with methamphetamine, or any amphetamine for that matter, insurance will not pay to go into treatment for say, a traditional 28-day program. And that's good and bad, because what we know about the brain with meth is that guys have a hard time focusing at all in their early recovery from meth. So you could be having a 12-hour day in an inpatient treatment center, and you would be present for about an hour of it. And the rest of the time, your brain is pretty darn fuzzy, because it's just not focusing so well. So that's part of the criteria. The reason they deny it, and insurance companies look for any excuse not to pay, but it doesn't have a traditional detox like an opiate, like a heroin does. However, what we know is that meth has a really pretty severe detox, especially in terms of psychology. People feel terribly depressed and pretty hopeless and really unable to function at a high level. There's a common expression, because a lot of the traditional patterns of partying are to maybe start on Thursday night, even Wednesdays, eventually grow into the whole week, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, parties, Saturday, start to slow down. Whoa, I better get this handle on this Sunday. And Monday they're trying to recover, and guess what Tuesday is called? Suicide Tuesdays. And called Suicide Tuesdays because the dopamine is depleted, people are feeling hopeless, people are feeling like there's just nothing that they can do about it. So it's really essential to deal with not only the feelings that come up, but some of these triggers, and to really understand that dopamine is a very visual drug. So we know some really interesting research with methamphetamine is that it's highly visual. It improves visual memory, and it impairs verbal memory. So verbal memory is what we use to understand words. So if somebody's newly clean or newly sober, sitting in a meeting of 12 steps and 12 traditions on the wall, it's going to be kind of just gibberish. People aren't going to understand a lot of the abstract concepts very easily, but the visual memory is enhanced. So that means that people are extremely sensitive to visual cues and triggers. About a year ago now, we did a town hall meeting here. Very well received. Got the conversation going. But one of the photographs that was in the newspaper covering it showed someone injecting. And that was just, it triggered, got a lot of feedback on that because it triggered a lot of people who are trying to sort of protect themselves and not be triggered by cues. I worked in the treatment centers in the 80s, back cocaine days. We didn't know any of this any better then. We would show like educational videos in treatment of people shooting up and smoking and all this stuff, and people in the rooms were like running out, the patients that couldn't deal with it because they're getting so triggered. Nobody knew why. That's why. It's a very visual connection. And this goes, by the way, for CMA too, Crystal Meth Anonymous. If people, they actually say in meetings to be very careful about the language you use, the description you use, because people get easily triggered. And CMA, part of the reason it exists is so people can talk about not only their drug use, but the sexual connections with it. And those sexual connections, if someone gets particularly descriptive about it, can really trigger people in a harmful way. So then, toward 6 months, a year, people start to deal with sexual stuff and intimacy, and a lot of handling feelings. And I think at that point, what is coming up a lot of feelings of worthiness, a lot of issues related to trauma. A lot of the work I'm really privileged to do, I do a lot of work with trauma therapy, and there's a tremendous amount of abuse, sexual abuse in the community, a sexual amount of traumatic experience. I like to look at, we classically think of trauma as abuse, or Iraqi war veterans, or a horrible car accident or a natural disaster. I think there's another, I like to think of a broader definition of trauma. In a type of therapy called EMDR, they call it trauma with a lowercase t, and that is chronic, kind of low-grade trauma, and I would equate bullying that a lot of us experienced for years as kind of a traumatic reaction over the years, and other kinds of chronic abuse and teasing and that kind of thing that really has a lot of issues that I see starting to play out when people get clean and decide to start feeling feelings. There's this also, I just want to mention this co-occurring sex addiction. Back in the old days, before we had good brain scans, the concept of sex addiction was very controversial. And that people said addiction had to be something that you ingest. and that behaviors such as even food, which you ingest, but they're saying food's not an addiction, gambling, credit cards, even shopping. All those things give you bursts of dopamine. They do the same thing that ingesting a drug does. Now we know, because we can study people's brains in real time, that when they're looking at porn or involved in sex addiction or even thinking about a hookup, you get out those apps that are so universal now, and somebody even looks at Grindr or Scruff, or their dopamine starts going. That's the ritual of this whole thing. So it's a very real and very co-involved phenomenon. In fact, when this book first came out, it cracked me up on Amazon. On Amazon they'll say, people that bought this also bought this. Within the first week, the very first thing that appeared was, people that bought your book also bought this 3-pack of black jock straps. That's interesting. So I guess it proved to me that I'm onto something here. So let me read another piece about this kind of co-occurring sex addiction. One factor common to both sex addicts and those ingesting meth is that both use sex as a mood changer to mask emotional pain. Sex ultimately becomes less about erotic desire and more directed toward avoiding emotional pain through the manipulation of the pain-killing effects of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. The major challenge of recovery from either or both is learning how to experience in healthy ways the various emotions that bubble up once the numbing effects have worn off. Both sex and meth addiction can be conceptualized as intimacy disorders. They compensate for the inability of an individual to adequately bond in intimate relationships, and indeed may cause or worsen any intimacy concerns that are present. The ultimate treatment goal for sex addiction, as with meth addiction, is mastering the experience of forming, enduring, and trusting intimate connections with others. And I would add an intimate connection with oneself. I think that's key. The most common barriers preventing addicts from achieving these intimate connections include shame, the ability to self-regulate emotions, and not maintaining sexual boundaries. And that really is the treatment plan for methamphetamine. Is really learning how to help people manage the emotions that bubble up, really how to reestablish sexual boundaries, and to really deal with shame. I think as gay men we have an awful lot of shame issues that are part of our core at every level, even if we're not necessarily aware of it. I think we really have to understand how those manifest in themselves. I mentioned connecting with yourself because I think it's so important for us. There's a wonderful book called The Velvet Rage. Anybody read that book? I've probably made some people read it. But it describes this phenomenon as gay men. The subtitle is Growing Up Gay in a Straight Man's World. And it's basically how we learn at an early age that there's something inherently wrong with how we're feeling, and we better not let anybody know. And so we start creating a false self out here that the universe sees, the universe interacts with, and it doesn't really match what we're feeling, and that kind of secretive piece that's inside us that we don't want to let anybody know is there. And so as we get into life and achieve, we feel that people are giving us applause and giving us attention for the outside. So I've had gorgeous men come into my office as patients, beautiful bodies, and just feeling like a piece of crap. And because their outside doesn't match the inside, there's that disconnect. So when I say connecting with oneself, it's really finding out, reconnecting with what's inside, and really reconnecting with that worthiness of self. So the third part of the book is really a lot of specific skills for this recovery process. There's a lot of them, including self-talk, changing self-talk. Self-talk is that voice that's constantly chirping in our ears, like, who are you? You can't do that. Who are you to think you can do that? What a piece of shit you are. I think we really have to identify that and really rewrite that, change it at a deeper level, and kind of rework that with positive stuff. I think self-compassion, there's something with addiction is so difficult for a lot of people, a lot of gay men to really feel okay about themselves and to really love themselves and be vulnerable. And I think that piece is a real struggle, but an essential one for this recovery part. My friend Chris and I do a lot of work with attention to the inner child. Really looking at ourselves, who's this little being inside me that's really hurting and needs attention sometimes, and is crying for attention, and we shove it aside or numb the feelings or disconnect. And I think reconnecting with that is really important. There's another skill I talk about, and that's the whole concept of shadows. Carl Jung, and I don't want to get too heavy here, but Carl Jung talked a lot about shadows. Shadows are those parts of ourselves that we don't want to recognize in ourselves, but we clearly see them in other people. So if you've ever walked into a room and took an instant dislike to someone you've never met before, that may be one of your shadows at play, or saying, boy, that person's really loud or nasty, and that's maybe a part of ourselves that we don't want to see or recognize. So I think really kind of shadows, I think, are a wonderful tool to sort of gain some self-awareness. I'll read a little bit about that. Shadows fuel addictions for several reasons. They cause extreme psychological discomfort that the conscious mind desperately desires to suppress or numb. Compulsive behaviors effectively distract the mind from this unease, while causing all kinds of other complications. As in the cases mentioned earlier, someone may be struggling with strong same-sex attraction, but be unable to admit it to themselves or later to others. That, by the way, is a perfect case of shadows. I guarantee if you look at any legislator at any level, local, state, federal, who is really adamantly homophobic, I guarantee they will be discovered in a back room or with an escort or some of that is perfectly an example of shadows, is not wanting to see it in themselves and being very, passing anti-gay laws, meanwhile having this whole other life. It's very common. Alcohol and opiates temporarily numb these feelings and force those unwanted parts of the self to remain in the subconscious. Someone else may be struggling with unexpressed anger. In such cases, their shadow is demanding to be recognized while consciously abhorring people expressing that trait. The disinhibiting effects of drugs such as alcohol and amphetamines allow these feelings to be expressed, sometimes with the excuse that the substance itself is the real culprit responsible for any negative behaviors. Methamphetamine has been used by gay men consistently to enhance sexual experiences. While it is obvious that meth use leads to terrible consequences, many men describe the drug's effectiveness at allowing them to express themselves sexually without concern or inhibition. They describe this initial experience as very liberating. One man stated, "On meth, I could finally celebrate gay sex and being gay." This disinhibition, of course, results in a lack of concern, all kinds of other problems. But I think that's a really important point to recognize. I think gay men don't use meth just because it's a drug out there on the street. They use meth because it makes them feel okay about themselves, or at least not care about the shame and concern. And I think that need for connection is something that we as a community need to really work on as well. I think we have so many different layers and levels, and we do so much shaming within our community. It just causes much more re-wounding. The final skill I just want to talk about that I mentioned in the book is mindfulness. And I think mindfulness is simply, to me, living in the present tense. Mindfulness is paying attention to what we're doing. I think a lot of us spend most of our day worrying about the future or regretting the past and really having a hard time staying right here. But I think it's an essential tool, especially for combating cravings. I write, mindfulness becomes a powerful tool to combat cravings and to begin to rewire some of the associations between drugs and other behaviors, particularly the fusion of meth and sex. Cravings for either sex or drugs are usually the only conscious part of a much larger system of associations beneath the surface. Often tied to emotions, these connections are usually rooted in the uncomfortable or unpleasant feelings we want to avoid. We've learned that drugs help us control these feelings through avoidance, numbing, in some cases even escalation, such as thrill-seeking and danger. And boredom, by the way. Boredom is a huge trigger. After a period of time, we are aware only of the craving and begin to lose touch with the initial spark of feeling that set it off. Mindfulness is the key to regaining some delayed insight. I think that's a really useful tool to talk about. So real quickly, because I don't want to talk forever and I'd love to see what's on your guys' mind, I want to talk about kind of five steps to reclaim one's sex life after meth. And I think this is where kind of the practical aspect starts to come in. And step number one is really to take a break from sex. I think after meth, meth and sex are so connected. Their world is so wrapped up thinking about sex, getting sex, recovering from sex, that it's sometimes nice to just put it on the shelf. Sexual desire may be dormant for a while anyway. You know, it may not, as I mentioned, it kind of goes away. But at some point, people do want to reintegrate it. And I think it's important at that point to know that trust that time will heal. Things do come back. It takes time. And as I mentioned before, it takes months and months for our brains to rewire those neural pathways and to kind of readjust to a normal level of stimulus. So many guys, I think, make the mistake of trying to recreate that meth sex without the meth. And they just keep the fantasies and the meth problem alive. That leads me to the second one, keeping meth mode alive by changing habits. So avoid any other drugs, including alcohol. And I've had so many clients come and say, you know, my problem is amphetamines. Why can't I have a beer? Go to Georgie's and have a drink or two. Alcohol's not my problem. Meth is my problem. Anybody have an answer for that?
Psychologically.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many clients I've had who went to Georgie's or anywhere else and had a beer or two, and suddenly their self-control and their inhibition goes away and they're out using meth. And so it kind of weakens their inhibition and their resistance abilities. So it may not be their high of choice, but it certainly pushes them in that direction. I also recommend getting rid of all sexual apps, or getting rid of profiles, deleting profiles. I know, gasp of horror from the room. I can't tell you how many clients I've had who have deleted their apps, reloaded them, deleted them, reloaded them over and over again. A fun fact you may or may not know, if you want to check yourself, the new iPhone, the iOS, I guess 8 or whatever it is, has a thing where you can look at your battery and say which app used the most battery time. And it's kind of a great way to get a bit of insight. You know, one guy, 86% of the time was on Grindr. Okay, well, you may have a problem. So changing phone numbers, changing emails, because people will reach out. You know, there's nothing worse than being a month clean and getting a text message from an old trick or an old dealer in the middle of the night, and just there it is, alive. I had a client recently who was on a site called BBRT, which you probably already know is bareback real time, right? It's a bareback site, hookup site, and he, with a lot of therapy, got rid of it. He was doing great, 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, still clean, and he came in and said, you know, BBRT sent me a message saying, we miss you. It's like, really? We miss you, please come back. So people have to be constantly vigilant about that. The other thing is to really avoid compulsive behavior. So hookups, try not to do the hookups. You try to have a date, a real date, not even a sex-involved date. Go for coffee, or as we say, coffee. The third step I mentioned before, don't try to recreate the meth sex without the meth. I think it's really important to grieve that meth sex, to really let it go, to be done with it, to really understand all the damage it does, to avoid types of porn that keep the fantasy alive. And this is a really common problem where people give up the drugs, but they still, if they're masturbating, they're thinking about meth-related porn. And that keeps all that stuff alive. All those neural pathways are brilliant, just ready to go. And so really, and that's probably the single biggest struggle, is to find other things that are arousing but unrelated to drugs. And so one of the ways I recommend doing that is looking at physical sensations. So get out of it. Meth is all about fantasies up in the head, right? If you can be with someone and really focus on physical sensations. There's a great exercise by Masters and Johnson called Sensate Focus, where people give and receive, and basically it's not a sexual exercise at all, but you take turns, 15 minutes, the pleasurer tickles, rubs, scratches, caresses, whatever, anything except the genital region, and gets feedback from their partner. I like that, I don't like that, too hard, too soft, too rough. And it's a very powerful communication. And then you switch. And the point is not sexual, but I've had couples who were together 20 and 25 years come back and say, I learned something about my partner by doing this exercise that I never knew. And so those are kind of skills that I think are really important, developing intimacy. And of course that takes a certain ability to tolerate some vulnerability in that sense as well. With the triggers that constantly come up, I'm just recommend all kinds of things. Distract yourself, take a walk in nature, pet your dog, make a call, work out, breathe, practice gratitude. There's a number of tools that are very powerful. The step 4 is to what I call redefine your sexual pleasure, to really focus on those physical sensations I met, to slow down, hookups, kind of throw them out the window, explore what turns you on that's not related to meth. Sometimes people have to go back to what turned them on years ago, as adolescents or as young adults, before drugs tainted that sexual desire, and really kind of go back and redefine that. To really redefine sex, as a sex therapist, I always tell people, sex is a lot more than orgasm. You know, it's not all just about orgasm. It's about other kinds of experiences that go with it. And finally, this thing I've been kind of harping on tonight, increase one's capacity for intimacy. I think that's so critical, to explore sex and emotions with one person over time, and to really explore the subtlety of a relationship. You know, there's really nothing subtle about methamphetamine and what goes with it. And I think that's a scary, very scary thing. Stay constantly present with the person you're with. Meth, any drug use, any addict will go up in their head. And sometimes the person they're with is just kind of an object in the fantasy playing out in their head. It's not a give and take, reciprocal kind of relationship. I mentioned before the empathy piece and how it's really damaged by meth. I talk about growing your empathy. You know, how do you intuitively experience someone else? To really practice. Empathy can be learned and developed. So put yourself in the other person's shoes. What might they be thinking? You know, I can understand that. I don't agree with it, but I can see how you'd be feeling that way. And just practice in and out. And I think it's important to develop a consciousness about our physical energy and our energy fields. I think, you know, how is my energy and my shadows and all my stuff affecting this person? And kind of be aware of that, of the impact we're having and the connections that every one of us in this room have. You know, just being in each other's presence. There's stuff going on here. I mentioned this with Masters and Johnson. And finally, learning to manage the anxiety and other feelings that bubble up during sex. I would say, without exception, at least that I can remember, every one of my clients have said, when they at least came in, they had never had sex without some mood-altering substance. It just didn't happen. And so when you take away alcohol or drugs or other kind of compulsive behaviors, sex could be pretty scary if there's nothing to numb those feelings. So it's very frightening. And finally, the idea of a support system is really critical. I mean, we have 12-step programs, we have Crystal Meth Anonymous, NA, AA, Smart Recovery for people that struggle with 12-step, and it can complement 12-step. And I think essential, and this is not just a shameless plug, but I think it's really important to have a therapist, because 12-step program is not therapy, and as I mentioned, all these feelings and emotions and even the skills that need to be talked about need to come on. So that's really the very compressed version of this book and what's talked about in it. And I would love to hear about you if you have questions or comments or whatever.